She was 19 and owned nothing but the clothes on her back, a canvas sack of tools, and the $58 her stepmother had pressed into her hand. With that money, she bought a worthless patch of desert in a place called Dry Fork, a claim abandoned decades ago. But what nobody knew, what the land agent didn't mention, was that the desert had swallowed a whole locomotive there, and locked inside its cab was a secret that would change her life forever. Settle in close, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. This is the story of Adeline Burke and the engine in the sand. Adeline's father had been a watchmaker, a man who believed the world was a series of intricate, interlocking movements, and that a person's worth was measured in their patience and the steadiness of their hands. He had taught her to see the beauty in a well-seated gear and the integrity of a true line. He died of a fever when she was 12, and the world he had so carefully assembled for her fell silent. Her stepmother, Eleanor, a woman who had married for security and found only the modest inheritance of a tradesman, saw Adeline not as a daughter, but as a ledger entry that refused to balance. Eleanor valued smooth surfaces and quiet rooms, and Adeline, with her grease-stained fingers and thoughtful silences, was a disruption. The true center of Adeline's world had been Silas Croft, the retired railroad engineer who lived next door. He was a widower, with hands as broad and calloused as iron plates, and he saw in Adeline the same love for machinery that had governed his own life. While other girls were learning needlepoint, Silas was teaching Adeline the anatomy of a steam engine. He taught her the difference between the hiss of a healthy boiler and the whisper of a leaking valve. He taught her how to true a piston rod, how to pack a gland, how to read the language of soot and steam. His workshop was a sanctuary of ordered metal, smelling of coal smoke, hot oil, and the sweet, sharp scent of grinding steel. He never spoke down to her, never treated her curiosity as a childish phase. He spoke to her as a peer, an apprentice in a sacred craft. For her 16th birthday, he gave her a box wrench, forged by his own hands. It was not a store-bought tool. It was perfectly balanced, the steel tempered to a deep, blue-black, with her initial, O, stamped into the head. "A good tool feels like part of your own hand," he'd said, his voice a low rumble. "It doesn't fight you, it knows the work." Silas passed 2 years later, a quiet departure in his sleep, and with him went the last of Adeline's anchors. She kept the wrench wrapped in an oilcloth, a tangible piece of the only person who had ever truly seen her. The day Adeline turned 19, Eleanor called her into the parlor. The room was already barer than usual, the good china packed away in wooden crates. Eleanor sat in a straight-backed chair, her hands folded in her lap, her expression as smooth and unreadable as polished stone. She did not ask Adeline to sit. "The house is sold," she said, her voice even and without inflection. "The papers were signed this morning. I will be moving to my sister's, in the city." There was no room for discussion. It was a statement of fact, an administrative decree. Adeline stood by the door, her hands loose at her sides, and simply nodded. She felt no shock, only the dull, heavy certainty of something long expected finally arriving. Eleanor gestured to a small envelope on the mantelpiece. "Your father left a small provision for you. After settling his debts and the cost of the sale, this is what remains. It is $58. The amount was an insult, a pittance scraped from the sale of a lifetime of her father's careful work, but Adeline knew better than to argue. Arguing with Eleanor was like arguing with a closed door. She took the envelope without a word. "You will need to be gone by morning," Eleanor added, her gaze fixed on a point just past Adeline's shoulder. Adeline went to her small room and began to pack. She did not weep. Tears were a currency Eleanor did not trade in. She folded the few sets of clothes she owned, sturdy trousers and shirts, most of them her father's, which she had painstakingly re-sewn to fit her own slender frame. She gathered her tools, laying them carefully on a square of canvas: calipers, files, a set of smaller wrenches, and a heavy ball-peen hammer. Finally, she unwrapped Silas's box wrench, its dark steel cool and solid in her palm. She placed it in the very center of the roll. She had a small rucksack and the canvas tool roll. That was all. She slept on the floor that night, her bed already dismantled and sold. In the morning, the house was silent. Eleanor was gone. Adeline walked out the front door and did not look back. The $58, a small, stiff rectangle in her pocket. It was not an ending. It was a pressure, a force, compelling her forward into a life that was now entirely her own. The journey west was a lesson in dust and distance. Adeline bought a ticket for the train, the cheapest seat in the last car, and for 3 days she watched the world transform through the grimy window. The rolling green hills of her home flattened into plains. The trees grew sparse and huddled close to unseen water, and the sky grew vast and pale. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the rails was a familiar comfort, a language Silas had taught her to understand. She could hear the labor of the engine, the steady chuff of the pistons, the metallic sigh of the brakes. At night, she did not sleep in her seat, but curled up on the floor between the benches, her tool roll a pillow beneath her head, preferring the solid vibration of the floorboards to the swaying uncertainty of the carriage. She ate sparingly, making the bread and dried apples she had bought last, and she spoke to no one. Her silence was a shield, a way of holding herself intact against the press of the world. At the end of the line, she found a freight wagon heading further into the territory, paying the driver $2 to ride atop a load of crated goods. The transition from the iron certainty of the rails to the lurching, swaying progress of the wagon was jarring. Here, the world was no longer a blur framed by a window, but an immediate, sensory press. The sun was a physical weight, relentless and white-hot. The air was thin and carried the scent of dust, creosote, and something ancient and dry. The driver, a man named Henderson, with a face like cracked leather, pointed out landmarks with a flick of his chin. "That's the Salt Flat," he'd grunted, gesturing to a shimmering expanse of white. "Nothing lives there." Adeline looked and saw not emptiness, but a landscape of subtle gradations, of light and shadow, of a beauty so stark it was almost painful. She saw the way the wind carved patterns in the sand, and the way a lone, twisted juniper clung to a rocky outcrop, a testament to a fierce and stubborn life. She learned the rhythms of the desert, the cool clarity of the mornings, the crushing heat of midday, and the profound, star-drenched silence of the nights. When they finally rolled into the outpost of Dry Fork, it felt less like an arrival and more like a surrender to the scale of the land. Dry Fork was little more than a dozen wooden buildings bleached to the color of bone, all huddled together as if for comfort against the immense, empty landscape. There was a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon, and a small office with a faded sign that read, "Territorial Land and Claim." Adeline walked into the office, the bell above the door jangling weakly. The agent was a thin man with a green eyeshade, hunched over a large, curling map pinned to the wall. He looked up, his expression a mixture of boredom and surprise. "Help you?" he asked. Adeline placed her hands on the counter. "I'm looking to buy a claim." He gestured to the map, which was dotted with small, square parcels, most of them marked with an X in pencil. "Not much left that's worth having," he said. "The good water claims are all took." Adeline's eyes scanned the map, moving past the desirable plots near the creek bed and out toward the edges, where the land was marked as arid and rocky. Her finger stopped on a small, unmarked square several miles from town. "What about this one?" The agent squinted. "Ah, that's the buried engine claim. Been on the books for 20 years. Nobody's ever wanted it." He explained that a flash flood, back in the 70s, had washed out a spur line, burying a locomotive and its tender under a mountain of sand and rock. The railroad company had written it off as a total loss, and the land had reverted to the territory. "It's yours for the filing fee," the agent said with a shrug. $15. "But I'm telling you, miss, there's nothing out there but sand and scrap." To him, scrap was worthless. To Adeline, who had learned from Silas that nothing made of good steel was ever truly worthless, it sounded like a promise. "I'll take it," she said, and counted out the $15. She walked the 3 miles out of town, following the agent's crude map. The sun was high and hot. Finally, she saw it. It wasn't just a pile of scrap. It was a monument. The sand had drifted up against it like a great wave, burying it to the top of its boiler. Only the smokestack, the steam dome, and the top of the cab were visible, jutting from the dune like the bones of some great, extinct beast. It was a mogul, a 260, she recognized instantly, a powerful freight hauler. The visible steel was scoured by wind and sand, the paint long gone, replaced by a deep, uniform coat of rust that glowed orange in the afternoon sun. The glass in the cab windows was shattered, but the iron body, the great, solid mass of it, seemed intact, a thing of immense and patient strength. Adeline walked around the perimeter of her new property, her boots sinking into the soft sand. She laid a hand on the hot steel of the smokestack. It was real. It was hers. She felt a profound sense of rightness, a feeling of having arrived at the one place in the world that was waiting for her. The work was a kind of prayer, a conversation with the desert, carried out in the language of shovel and steel. Adeline began at dawn each day, before the sun had baked the air to a shimmer, and worked until the heat forced her to seek the sliver of shade cast by the buried engine. She had bought a sturdy shovel and a pickaxe in town, and her first task was to uncover the cab. The sand was heavy and dense, packed hard by years of wind and weather, and each shovelful was a victory. Her hands, already calloused from her time with Silas, blistered and then hardened into tough leather. Sweat slicked her hair to her forehead and stung her eyes, and the silence was broken only by the scrape of her shovel and her own steady breathing. Days bled into one another, measured not by a clock, but by the slow, incremental revealing of the locomotive. First, the roof of the cab emerged, then the tops of the windows, and finally, the running board and the high, spoked driving wheels. She was not just moving sand, she was excavating a history, peeling back the layers of time that had entombed this magnificent machine. After a week of relentless labor, the entire right side of the cab was free. The door, however, was jammed shut, its iron hinges fused by rust, the frame warped by the pressure of the earth. She spent a full day working on it, dripping precious oil into the seams, tapping at the hinges with her hammer, trying to coax the frozen metal into movement. Finally, she brought out Silas's wrench. She fitted it over the large bolt on the lower hinge, a bolt no other tool she had could grip. She wrapped a cloth around the handle for leverage, set her feet, and pulled. The metal groaned, a deep, protesting shriek that vibrated through the wrench and up her arms. She pulled again, putting her entire body into the effort, her muscles screaming. With a sudden, sharp crack, the rust gave way. The door shuddered open a few inches, releasing a puff of dry, ancient air. She used a crowbar to pry it the rest of the way. The interior was a solid wall of sand that had poured in through the broken windows. It took her another 2 days to empty it, bucket by bucket, until she could finally stand inside the cramped iron space. The engineer's seat, its leather upholstery cracked and faded, was still bolted to the floor. The gauges on the backhead were shattered, their needles frozen in time. As she was clearing the last of the debris from the firebox, her fingers brushed against something that was not brick or sand. It was a small, steel box, no bigger than a loaf of bread, welded shut and tucked deep into a corner. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She worked at it carefully, using a cold chisel and her hammer to break the welds. The lid finally came free. Inside, nestled in a bed of dry cloth, was a stack of banknotes, a small leather-bound journal, and a single, perfectly smooth, gray and white agate. She sat back on her heels, the desert sun streaming through the cab window, and opened the journal. The first page was not a log entry, but a letter, the handwriting a neat, steady cursive. My name is Elias Vance. I was the engineer of this engine, number 47. If you are reading this, then the flood got the better of me, and the railroad has given us up for lost. We were caught in a flash flood in a narrow canyon, and the track washed out from under us. The water pushed us here, before the sand came and buried us. Inside this box is my life savings, $370. It is not a fortune, but it is an honest sum earned over 20 years on the rails. There is also a journal of my runs, and an agate my daughter gave me for luck. She was taken by the fever when she was 6. I have no other family to leave this to. If you have found it, it is because you have worked for it. Use it to build something good. Do not let the desert have the last word. Adeline closed the journal, her fingers tracing the name Elias Vance. She looked at the money, the tangible result of a man's life of labor. She picked up the agate, its surface cool and smooth against her palm. In the silence of the cab, surrounded by the great, sleeping machine, she felt a profound connection to this stranger, this fellow traveler who had left a map for the future in the heart of his engine. The $370 felt heavier than gold in her pocket. It was not just money. It was a trust, a responsibility passed from one pair of working hands to another. Adeline walked back into Dry Fork, no longer a transient with a foolish notion, but a woman with capital and a plan. Her first purchase was a proper canvas tent, thick and waterproof, and a small wood stove that could ward off the surprising chill of the desert nights. She bought sacks of flour, beans, and coffee, a new set of work gloves, and 2 large barrels for water. She now had the means not just to survive, but to establish a real foothold. Her quiet, relentless work on the engine had not gone unnoticed. A young man named Caleb, who made his living hauling water from the deep well east of town, began to make the trip out to her claim. The first time, he simply left a full barrel near her campsite without a word. Adeline found him in town the next day and paid him for the water and for the next month's deliveries. A silent agreement was struck. Every Tuesday morning, Caleb's wagon would appear on the horizon, and he would exchange her empty barrel for a full one, sometimes leaving a small parcel from the general store, a newspaper, or a piece of salted meat, a quiet gesture of connection. The town blacksmith, Jedediah Croft, a man in his 60s with a wild gray beard and arms corded with muscle, eventually rode his horse out to see the engine for himself. He circled the excavated locomotive, his expert eye taking in the state of the boiler, the frame, the driving rods. He looked at the work Adeline had done. The neat piles of sand, the carefully organized salvageable parts. He looked at her hands. "You know your way around steel," he said. It was the highest compliment he could give. Adeline told him about her plans to salvage the boiler plates and the brass fittings. "You'll need a hotter forge than you can manage in a campfire," he said, "and tools you don't have." He made her an offer. She could use his forge in the evenings, after his own work was done, and he would help her craft the specialized cutters and pullers she needed. In return, she would give him a share of the high-quality steel she recovered. They shook on it, their hands calloused and capable, sealing a partnership built on mutual respect for the craft. Marta, the woman who ran the general store, began to greet Adeline by name, extending her a line of credit without being asked. "Pay me when you can," she said, her smile warm. "A woman working that hard deserves a bit of trust." The community was not built with declarations, but with these small, practical acts of support. It was a chain of work and worth, each person contributing their skill, water, iron, credit, food, and in doing so, they were helping Adeline rebuild, not just a machine, but a life. Slowly, Adeline's claim transformed from a desolate patch of sand into a place of purpose. The locomotive, once a tomb, became the heart of her world. It was her workshop, her quarry, and her fortress against the wind. People in Dry Fork no longer called it the buried engine claim. They called it Addie's engine. It had become a landmark, a testament to her singular vision and tireless labor. With Jedediah's help, she had learned to cut rivets and free the heavy sheets of boilerplate. She salvaged brass valves, copper piping, and cast iron fittings, all of which had value. She traded the raw materials with Jedediah for finished goods, sturdy hinges and latches for a permanent shelter, a custom-made set of tools, and even a small, efficient cook stove forged from the very steel she had recovered. Using salvaged railroad ties for a foundation, and heavy timbers for the frame, she built a small, one-room shack, nestled in the protective lee of the engine's massive boiler. The walls were made of plate steel, riveted together, and the roof was fashioned from the curved top of the tender. It was not a pretty home, but it was solid, weatherproof, and entirely her own. Inside, it was a space of simple order. A cot stood in one corner, a small table and chair in another. Her tools were hung in neat rows on the wall, and the small stove radiated a steady warmth against the cold desert nights. Her days fell into a comfortable rhythm. Mornings were for the hard, physical work of salvage. Afternoons were for sorting and cleaning her finds, or for reading from Elias Vance's journal. She read his accounts of hauling freight through mountain passes in winter, of battling snowdrifts and frozen switches, and of the simple pleasure of a hot meal at the end of a long run. He wrote about his daughter, about the small, smooth stone she had found in a riverbed and given to him. Through his plain, honest words, he became a living presence, a silent mentor, sharing the wisdom of his years. In the evenings, she would often walk into town to work at Jedediah's forge, the ringing of her hammer on steel, a familiar song in the quiet streets of Dry Fork. She was no longer an outsider. She was a fixture, a part of the town's small, interlocking community. She was Adeline Burke, the girl who was digging up a train, the woman who could make dead iron useful again. The sun was setting, painting the western sky in strokes of deep orange and violet, the colors bleeding into the vast, dusty blue above. Adeline sat on the heavy steel running board of the mogul, the metal still holding the day's warmth. The desert air was cooling rapidly, carrying the clean, sharp scent of sage and dry earth. Behind her, a warm yellow light glowed from the single window of the small, sturdy shack she had built, a beacon of her own making in the immense twilight. The locomotive was fully excavated now, a great, dark leviathan resting in a crater of sand, its rust-colored flanks looking less like decay and more like the hide of some ancient, patient creature. She had finished her work for the day and was performing the final ritual, cleaning her tools. She wiped each one with an oiled rag, feeling the familiar weight and balance, checking the edges and surfaces for wear. This was a habit Silas had instilled in her, a sign of respect for the tools and for the work they enabled. She took up the custom-made box wrench, his gift, and ran her thumb over the small, stamped A. It felt like an extension of her own hand, a conduit for the knowledge and care he had passed down to her. She set it carefully on the running board beside her. From her pocket, she took out the small, smooth agate left by Elias Vance. She rolled it between her palms, its polished surface a cool, comforting weight. Two objects from two good men, strangers to each other, both of whom had lived by the integrity of their work. Silas had taught her how to build. Elias had given her the means to begin. She thought of Eleanor, her stepmother, not with the sharp edge of anger anymore, but with a quiet, distant sorrow. Eleanor had looked at Adeline's father's life, at his workshop full of intricate tools and half-finished timepieces, and had seen only assets to be liquidated. She had looked at Adeline and seen only a liability. She could never have understood that the truest inheritance wasn't money, but skill, not a house, but the knowledge of how to build one. Adeline Burke was 19 years old and had been cast out with $58 to her name. She had spent 15 of it on a piece of land everyone said was worthless, a claim defined by a wreck. It was the best $15 she had ever spent. She had found a home, not in a house, but in a purpose. The desert had not taken the locomotive. It had merely been keeping it safe for her. The silence of the vast landscape was no longer a sign of emptiness, but of peace. She had learned to listen to it, to understand its subtle language. She had taken what was abandoned and given it new life, and in doing so, had forged a new life for herself. The engine, the shack, the tools, the quiet respect of her neighbors. This was her inheritance, earned with her own two hands. It was more than enough. Thank you for joining us for Adeline's story. If her journey of resilience and reclamation moved you, consider subscribing and sharing this story with someone who appreciates the quiet strength of the human spirit. We leave you with this thought. What have you found of value in a place others have overlooked? Let us know in the comments below. We'll see you again next time.